Hello, everybody. Good morning. So we've gone over the Revolutionary War, and so now we're going to talk about what happened after the Revolutionary War. So, as we can recall, after the Revolutionary War, we are living under the Articles of Confederation. The Articles of Confederation, and there were two big flaws to this form of government. There was no ability to tax, which was the biggest flaw, and no standing army. But the no ability to tax was by far its biggest flaw. Now, why was this a problem? So, after the war, the Americans were in not only domestic debt, so debt owed to its own people, and foreign debt. So, we have, which leads me to talk about Daniel Shea, and he is known for what is going to, which is no, or he's known for Shea's Rebellion. Now, keep in mind what I'm about to share with you and what we're about to go over. This is all going to be part of your essay questions. So, Shea's Rebellion. Now, one of your essay questions talks about the list of compromises and the people involved in those compromises to ultimately ratify and approve the Constitution. So I would start off talking about Daniel Shea and Shea's Rebellion. And ultimately, what Daniel Shea's Rebellion taught us was that we need a new government. The Articles of Confederation are not going to work. So Shea's Rebellion lets the people know that we need to start talking about a new government. So now that brings me to my next character. Now it's important to take note of the people that I'm about to introduce to you. It's going to start with Alexander Hamilton. Alexander Hamilton um, is the one who basically spearheaded the whole new talk about government, the need for a new government. So, the Annapolis Convention. Less than half of the states show up. So that is 5 out of 13 states show up. And the whole point of the Annapolis Convention was to basically discuss the problems that we have with the Articles of Confederation in hopes of creating a new government. And so this was a bust. His plan ultimately failed. Less than half of the states showed up, meaning nothing was going to get done. So this brings us to our next person we want to note in our essay if we do have this essay question. So George Washington. George Washington is formally the leader of the Continental Army. So Alexander and George Washington are very close friends. Alexander served with George Washington through the duration of the Revolutionary War. And if anyone's going to get anybody to show up to this convention, it's going to be George Washington. So George Washington's role in all this is that he's not only going to be the president, not the United States, but the president of the Constitutional Convention. But George Washington's going to be the person that's going to get everybody to actually show up. So, president of the Constitutional Convention, he's going to be basically the main delegator in this whole issue. So, we have Alexander Hamilton initiating the discussion of a new government in the Annapolis Convention. That's a bust. Only half of the states show up. That's 5 out of 13. So, he goes to George Washington. George Washington is the person who's going to convince, well, not convince, but tell everybody, yo, we need to show up. We need to discuss our government and the state that it's in. It's not going well. And so this brings us to our Grand Convention. So take note of this. We're going to talk about now the Grand Convention. Or the Constitutional Convention, if you will. So where is this taking place? This is taking place in Philadelphia. A lot of things happen in Philadelphia. So now let's see. So at this convention, there are certain things that are being discussed. The first issue was how are states to be represented? So we are introduced to two plans, one of them being the Virginia plan. The Virginia plan emphasized proportional representation. Proportional representation means so more population equals more representation. So this is also known as the Big State Plan. So according to the Virginia plan, states who have the most people have more representation in the government. So this is an issue because what is good for bigger states may not work well for the smaller states. Take, for instance, Rhode Island or Boston, very small, very not as populated, say, as the southern states, Philadelphia, New York. So that's one of our plans. The next plan we are introduced to is the New Jersey plan. Try to write that down so you guys can see it a little bit more. So the New Jersey plan called for equal representation. My spelling is atrocious right now. Equal representation. That's going to be our. That's going to stand for representation because I'm not going to spell that out the whole time. So equal representation, meaning every state has the same amount of votes or the same amount of delegates or representatives that are going to be in charge of making the laws, so on and so forth. So these are our two issues over what again? How states should be represented. All right, so you're introduced to our two plans. And I want to let you guys know, as I'm going through this, I want you guys to take note of these. Make an extra pair of notes because I am highlighting the most important parts for you. So our first issue is over how are states going to be represented in our new government. You see that okay? So what do we have here? So let's look at the ideas of the North, the northern colonies, as opposed to the southern colonies. What they want out of this new government that we are making. So the North, they want abolishment, meaning the abolishment of slavery, and basically that is their main objective. Because for the most part, northern states have already outlawed slavery. Now the South, I think we're familiar with what the South wants. And the South, they want guaranteed property rights. They want slaves to count in population. And why would they want slaves to count in population? Remember what we previously talked about. More population equals more representation, more votes in how laws are to be made. So the North wants abolishment, and the South, they want guaranteed property rights and slaves to count as population. So this is going to, so we already have, okay, how are we going to be represented? The um, two geographical areas and what their main objectives are. And so now the issue is how are we going to be represented, and how are we going to satisfy the North and the Southern delegates? How are we going to satisfy these groups of people? Now I'm going to make another diagram for you. So now we are introduced to our first group of political parties. So now at the Grand Convention, we are introduced to two groups: the Anti-Federalists and the Federalists. These are two groups of people. Each one of them has a different opinion on what type of government our new country should have. The Anti-Federalists, for one, their main concern are human rights, the rights of its people, and they want a weaker, centralized government. They're concerned over human rights and a weaker, centralized government. They want to make sure that government does not become too powerful or too strong to the point where it infringes on people's human rights. Now, as the founding fathers were enlightened individuals, and those basic rights of people, as adapted by Thomas Jefferson, were life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness. And this is all based off of John Locke's contract theory of government, where in John Locke's version, the pursuit of happiness is property. But for us, now, it's all about the pursuit of happiness. Now, the Federalists, they want a strong centralized government. So the Anti-Federalists are concerned over a democracy. They want a democracy where the government is ran by the people. Now, the Federalists, they want a republic, which is where the government is ran by other officials. You guys have a class in here?
No, there's going to be an event at 1, I believe.
All right, what time?
I think it's at 1, right?
All right, cool. Well, I'm recording a session right now, so give me a little bit. So the Federalists want a republic, which is basically a government ran by elected officials from the inside. Elected officials. So government ran by people, government ran by, well, government people. Let the best people make the decisions. Let the people make all the decisions. Those are our two groups, the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. Now keep all these people in mind because we're going to have to compromise. And in a way, we have to make sure to satisfy all these things such as representation, the long-term effects of its people, and ultimately the type of government that we are going to have. Okay, so we went through Alexander Hamilton. Alexander Hamilton initiated the discussion. George Washington brought everybody together. And through weeks of bickering and commotion, George Washington called a recess, a break for about a week or so to everybody can go home, talk, squash it out, talk about what's going to be best, think about what's going on. But George Washington goes to the one man that ultimately everybody's going to listen to, and that is good old Ben Franklin. Ben Franklin, we know he's up there in age. Ben Franklin is going to give us our last great compromise. So now we can talk about the great compromise. So one, we have a bicameral legislature. So by bicameral legislature, and we know that the legislative branch makes the laws. So bicameral, what does that mean? That means two parts. And in these two parts, we get the House of Reps and the Senate. Now, the House of Reps is based on proportional representation, whereas the Senate is equal. So recall that was the first issue that we talked about, how we're going to be represented. Now this satisfies both sides because in the House of Representatives, the people are elected, or the officials are elected by the people, whereas the Senate, they're elected by statesmen. So the people have say in the laws, or the people that pass laws for their sake. Remember in the Revolutionary War, what's the ultimate thing was that we didn't have representation in the parliament, therefore we didn't have to pay taxes and we shouldn't have to be subjected to their laws. So this satisfied how we're going to be represented. And then we also have a 3-branch government system. Now, this comes from good old Baron de Montesquieu that we learned back in chapter 4, who broke our government into 3 parts: the legislative, executive, and judicial. So this satisfies the Federalists not wanting a weaker centralized government, because if it was a very strong centralized government, we probably would only have one area, one branch. But breaking up into 3 allows for the checks and balances. So we have the 3 branches of government. Now, there are a few. Now how are we going to satisfy the South, the slave owners, the people that are basically saying, nope, we gotta do this. We can't do this without slavery, and we want our slaves to count as population. So Ben Franklin also gives us the 3/5 clause. Now the 3/5 clause basically says 10% of slaves count as population. Slaves are not considered citizens, and the slave trade must end in 20 years. So they were like, okay, 20 years, we have time to do what we need to do. We'll shut it down. So the South was like, okay, but there's one last group, the Anti-Federalists, led by none other than Alexander Hamilton. Now, they were worried about a strong centralized government, so we took care of that with the 3 branches. But the one thing that they were mostly concerned about were human rights and the fact that the government should not be able to infringe on those rights. So this is where we get the Bill of Rights. These are the first 10 amendments to our Constitution. Now these, in the Bill of Rights, these are rights that the government will never, ever be able to touch or mess with. These are things that the government will never be able to change or affect. And so this makes sure that those individual rights of the people are protected by the government. So now that allows for the Anti-Federalists to drop their opposition. And with these compromises, we are finally able to ratify the Constitution in 1788. Whew. All right. So I hope that prepares you all for for one of your essay questions. If you, I'm gonna update this I'm gonna try to upload this to Canvas, and if it works, go ahead and like or reply to the video and let me know that you actually watched it and used it, because we can use those numbers to show that we're actually doing something on Canvas. Thank you very much.